Let's crochet an easy granny stitch dress out of 2 simple hexagons. I'll show you how to make our tailored to you dress pattern step by step, and by the end of this video, you will have a perfectly customized for your body dress to wear out with your football player boyfriend or to wherever you may find yourself going. I'm using Color Theory for this, which is a worsted weight category 4 yarn from Lion Brand, and I'm going to be using a size K, which is a 6mm crochet hook, but it is always okay to adjust your hook size to meet the pattern gauge. You'll also want to follow along with the written pattern to know the exact stitch counts for your size. All the pattern links are down below in the description box. To start our hexagons, we are going to begin with a magic ring, and the way that I like to do that is just fold my loop over, insert my hook, pull up a loop like this, and then just pull a slip stitch to close it. So then I'm going to chain 3 stitches. This part can be a little slippery, but it'll get a lot easier once we get this magic ring finished. I like to untwist the magic ring a little bit at this point, and then we're going to work 2 double crochets right here in the loop. So there's 1 and 2, and in this pattern, we are going to refer to clusters often, and a cluster just means a group of 3 double crochets. So that first chain 3, that's going to count as 1 double crochet. So we have 1 cluster here. We need to end up with 6 clusters, and those are going to become our 6 sides of our hexagons. So now I'm going to chain 1. So I have 1 cluster and 1 chain 1, and now we need 5 more clusters and chain 1s. So I'm going to double crochet right there in the loop. That's 1, and then 2 and 3. So that's another cluster now. And then I'm going to follow it up with a chain 1. So now I have 1 cluster, 1 chain 1, and 1 cluster, 1 chain 1. So let's do that same thing 4 more times so that we end up with 6 clusters. All right, and now I have 6 clusters, and believe me, it is worth triple checking this number because everything is based off having 6 clusters here. So there's definitely been some times I've ended up with 5 and not realized it for a few rounds. So you want to double check that, and I'm going to pull the strand of yarn out here from my magic ring or loop because it just makes it easier to close it down and tighten it up. And then I've done my last chain 1, so I'm going to insert my hook at the top of that chain 3 from the beginning of the round and then just slip stitch to close it off. So now what we should have are 6 clusters and 6 chain 1 spaces. And this pattern is always worked in turned rounds or rows. So what that means is that at the end of every row, we're going to turn our work and work back in the opposite direction. And whether you are going to use 1 yarn throughout or change colors every round, it doesn't matter. We're going to work back in the opposite direction. So for simplicity, I'm going to keep this color attached to teach you the next step in this. And then in a few minutes, I'll show you how to change colors at the end of a round if that's what you'd like to do. So for round 2, I'm going to chain 3, and I like to make these chains kind of tight because I find that they're better disguised that way. And I'm going to turn my work, and this is the only time where it's kind of hard to see the spaces we're working into because they're only a chain 1 space. But from here, I'm going to put another double crochet and another double crochet. So if you remember, that chain 3 counts as our first double crochet. Now we have 2 more, so we have our first cluster here. After that, we're going to chain 3, and that's how we're going to work our corners from now on. So this is going to be our first real corner here. I've chained 3, and now I'm going to work another cluster right in that same chain 1 space. So on this round, we're going to double the number of clusters we have. We're going to go from 6 to 12. And that's going to mean that every space that we currently have from round 1 is going to get 2 clusters and separated by chain 3. So now I'm going to work in the next upcoming corner here. So I'm going to chain 1 in between, and then I'm going to go to the next corner and I'm going to do 3 double crochets and then 3 chains and 3 more double crochets. So that'll create 1 cluster and then 3 chains separating it to make the corner, and then 1 more cluster. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have going here. You'll see here's my first cluster, chain 3, second cluster, this is a chain 1. Here's another cluster, another chain 3, and another cluster. So my next step would be to chain 1, then work another set of 3 double crochets, 3 chains, and 3 double crochets here. And then we're gonna chain 1, and we're gonna repeat that all the way around. So what we should end up with at the end of the round is 6 corner chain 3 spaces and 12 total clusters. All right, at the end of round 2, I'm going to switch to a new color. So this is definitely optional. If you don't want to have any ends to weave in, just pick a great color and stick with it, or else use a self-striping yarn. But I am going to switch now to this nice mustard color. And the way I'm going to do that is I have my last chain 1 here on my hook, but I haven't slip stitched to my chain 3 from the beginning of the round yet. So I'm going to insert my hook there, and then I'm going to grab my new color of yarn and perform that slip stitch with my new color. So that makes a little bit cleaner join. I've already snipped off my first color, so I can hold them both in my hand. And I find that I just need to hold this tight as I work my first chain 3 of the next round. But as you can see, it's a pretty clean transition. And now I'm going to chain 3, and I'm going to turn and work back in the other direction. So now we're working with our new color, and you can see this is starting to get a little bit wavy, and that is intentional. You can see here a very baby half cardigan emerging. You have what's going to be a sleeve and the main body there. So if it's not wavy, you wouldn't have enough fabric to create this whole front and back. So it's not supposed to lay flat, at least after round 3 or so. So now we're going to continue increasing in each corner. So the corners are the spaces that we have our chain 3s, and it's going to become clearer and clearer what those are. But for now, we have just 1 space in between each corner, 1 chain, 1 space. So in each chain 1 space, we're just going to work a cluster, and then we're going to chain 1, and that's going to move us over to the corner. So here is the rest of my cluster here. So I have that chain 3 from the beginning, and then 2 more, and you can see it's already getting a little loose here, so I'm just going to tighten it down, and then I'll deal with that more when I weave in my ends. But that's kind of normal for it to get a little bit loose when you're changing colors. Now I'm going to chain 1, and I'm at the corner now, my first corner. So just like before, we're going to crochet a cluster, so that's 3 double crochet, and then we're going to separate it by 3 chains. First cluster, 1, 2, 3, and then 3 more double crochet. All right, so you can see that corner looks a little bit more distinct, and so I'm going to chain 1 after that cluster because I'm just going to work a cluster. We're not quite to another corner yet, so I chained 1, I'm going to work 3 double crochet here, and then I'm going to chain 1 again, and now I'm at another corner. So if you remember, just like we did before, we're going to do 3 double crochet, chain 3, and 3 more double crochet. At the end of my corner, I'm going to chain 1, and in each chain 1 space, we're just going to work another 3 double crochets. That's always going to have a chain 1 space before it and after it, and then in the corners, we're going to work our 1 cluster of 3 double crochets, 3 more chains, and then another cluster of 3 double crochets. So if you are not much of an auditory learner and you want to just look at something really clear and visual, the stitch chart can be super helpful, just showing you where the increases happen and how frequently they happen. Because you'll see there's really just a couple rules to know with this entire hexagon, and that is that in every corner, we're going to work a cluster, and then chain 3, and then another cluster, and then we're always going to do a chain 1 space between the rest of the clusters, And then in any chain one space, we're just gonna work a regular cluster. So I'm going to complete this round here. And then at the end of this round 3, we should have a total of 18 clusters, and we should always have 6 corners because this is a hexagon. And then each side should have 3 clusters. So 1, 2, 3. So it's good to check here and make sure you're on track. And then in a couple of rounds, it will be important to measure our gauge. That's how we're going to make sure that the dress that you're making ends up the size that you expect it to be. And we're going to measure that so that if you have to start over, it's not that much work, but if somehow you have managed to hit the gauge on the first try, you'll just be off to the races and continue working on your hexagon. So I'm going to switch colors now. And again, you definitely do not need to switch colors every round. Only do this if you're okay with weaving in ends because it does create a lot of them. If you're not okay with that, just work with the same color for more rounds. You don't have to switch every round. If you switched every 4 rounds, you'd have a lot fewer ends to weave in. Okay, so I just pulled that last slip stitch through using my new color, and my previous color is fastened off. So now I can just chain 3. Again, I'm holding my tails tight there. I'm going to tighten down my chain and turn my work and work in the opposite direction. As you can see, it's becoming clearer what are the sides and what are the corners here in our hexagon. So we're always going to be finishing our round on a side. So it's kind of like in the middle of the side, but then we're going to be working toward a corner. So I just worked my first cluster there. I did a chain 1 to get to the corner, and now this is where I'm going to put those 2 clusters and my chain 3. All right, so there is my first corner. I'm going to chain 1, and then now I have a couple spaces where I'm just going to work a regular cluster. So this is how we're going to work like this around the hexagon, and we're just going to continue working these hexagon rounds. Each round should increase by 1 cluster per side. So if you remember, in round 2 we had 2 clusters per side. In round 3 we have 1, 2, 3, and then in round 4 we're going to have 1, 2, 3, and then once I add the corner here we'll have 4 per side. So that's marked in the pattern, and we will meet back here in just a minute and I will show you how to measure your gauge. And when we have 8 rounds complete, we're going to pause and measure our gauge. This step is super important, so please don't skip it. This is what's going to ensure that your project ends up the size that's listed in the pattern, and that's simply because your stitch tension is going to be matching the stitch tension that all the math in the pattern is based on. So to measure our gauge here, we're going to take 2 measurements. One is of the radius of our hexagon. So radius, if you don't remember from middle school math, it is from the center out to one side. So I like to take this measurement in a few places just in case there's a bit of inconsistency throughout the overall hexagon. And we just want to make sure that we are measuring around 4 inches from the center of the hexagon out to the edge of the side. So I'm going to measure that in a few places. If you're somewhere in the range of around 4 inches or 4.25 inches, that's about 10 or 11 centimeters, you are in great shape. Again, I would try this in a few places just to make sure it's consistent. As long as you're in that range of around 4 inches or 10 centimeters, you're in great shape. A second measurement we want to take is across the side. So I'm spreading this out fully and I'm measuring from one hexagon corner over to the other. And we want this measurement to be about 8 inches. 8 inches, 8.25 inches, 8 1/4. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to about 24 centimeters. And again, you want to measure that on several sides just to make sure it's consistent. If that is the gauge that you have also, you can carry on in the pattern. If you find that your hexagon's considerably smaller or larger than that, you're going to want to start over. I hate to say it, but it's totally worth it. You're going to want to start over with a different hook size. And our crochet tension is completely personal, so it's always okay to adjust your hook size to match the gauge of a pattern. If you're finding that your measurement here is too small, it's 3 inches or 3.5 inches, or your measurement here is too small, you're going to want to start over with a larger hook. And if you're finding that your measurement is too big, in either way, you're going to want to try again with a smaller hook. Now, if you're in the course, I have a whole detailed section on a gauge. So if you're finding that you're off by a little bit, check out that, because that'll give you some more suggestions. Say if one section is measuring correctly, but the other isn't,
There are tips in there for making sure you get on track. Again, this is just an important step so that we make sure that our stitches are the same size moving forward. And once you've figured out the right hook size to meet the pattern gauge, you can carry on confidently knowing that your sweater is going to turn out the size that we expect. So assuming that your gauge is on track, this is the point at which I like to label my hexagon sides. And you may wonder, why are we going to pin little notes to ourselves on our hexagons? The reason why is that there's a lot of geometry going on here. That's the magic of these hexagon garments, but it also means that it's important to keep things oriented. And I have developed this system because I find it an easier way to explain what needs to happen in writing, in the written pattern, and also it just helps anchor you so you have to do less mental figuring out all the time about where you are in time and space. So there's a few rules about how we label these. Number one, it is the same whether you're right or left-handed. So when you lay your hexagon out, I realize it's going to look a lot more wavy than this, but the place at which you are joining each round, so that's the place where your round begins here and it ends here and you're slip stitching, that is signified right here by this little hash. So that is what we're going to label side one. Then right-handed crocheters and left-handed crocheters, you're going to move counterclockwise and label the sides as follows. From there, moving left, you're going to have side 2, side 3, side 4, and so on. When you're initially putting these labels on, you want to make sure that the right side of your fabric is facing. And in our patterns, the way you can tell that is it's noted in each row, so you can know, okay, if I just finished that round, was it a right side or a wrong side round, and use that as reference. But also typically you can look at the very first round. Usually in our patterns, that is going to be a right side round. And when you can see the front of those stitches facing you, you know that you have the right side facing, and you can attach your labels like this. And one important thing to keep in mind as you work with these is that the position never changes. So this is side 5, no matter how we have our hexagon folded, no matter what is going on that side, it stays side 5 forevermore. Until you take these off and you have a nice sweater to wear. So this is important information that will be referenced over and over again as the pattern continues. So I really recommend just pinning a little note to yourself on each of your sides right now. And if you're working from the PDF, then you have these cute little notes that you can print out and you want to pin them onto your hexagons. If you're not working from a printed pattern, then just make little notes like this, 6 of them, numbered 1 through 6 with right on 6 of them and 1 through 6 with left on 6 of them. Now let's talk about what this mention of right and left mean. This is referring to if this hexagon is going to live on the right side of your body when you're wearing it or the left side of your body. So again, this all just comes back to the geometry we're going to work with as the pattern progresses. So we want to know that the right hexagon is always going to stay the right hexagon. So it's going to be on this side of my body, and the left is going to be on this side of my body. So I like to label them with that note so that everything that we need to know that we've established about our hexagon kind of travels with it as a little bit of information as we crochet. So go ahead, put your labels on there, you will thank yourself later, and then you can proceed in the pattern.
When your hexagon is complete, you should have something that looks a bit like this. It's kind of like an amoeba, and it's totally fine that it's not laying flat. It's not supposed to, because what we want to be able to do is fold it into an L shape. So I'm going to pinch here at side 1 and just bring those 2 corners of side 1 together, and then the other corners sort of naturally fall into place. So I've got side 3 here and side 5 are going to form the front and back of my dress, and then side 1 is the one that's folded into the sleeve. And everything sort of cascades from there. So now you want to make a second hexagon that's identical to this first one, same number of rounds, same stripes, everything exactly the same. And then we'll come back here and talk about how to extend some of the sides in order to adjust the bust of your dress. And when you have 2 hexagons complete, you have something that's really starting to look a little bit like a sweater when you fold them both together. So that's exciting. And now we're going to extend the front and the back a bit, and that's going to adjust the chest circumference of your dress. So in our No Fail Garments course, we have a detailed tutorial about adjusting the bust circumference depending on what sort of fit you want and what type of body you have. So check that out if you're interested, because we go into a lot of detail there about how to get the perfect
perfect fit for your body. But the main ideas here are that we want to add some length along this side right here on the front and the back, and that's what's going to give us a little bit more slack around our chest. And you may notice here that I have some stitch markers placed. The point of these is to mark where we want our back extension and our front extensions to end. So if you've worked any of our hexagon patterns before, typically our back extension goes all the way along the side, and sometimes the front extension does also, often it does. But in this case, we want to have a little bit more of an open neckline. So this is just indicating that our back extension is going to work right along here, and that's going to leave a little bit open along the top of the back. So this would be like around the bottom of your neck to show just a bit of skin there. If you don't like that idea, you can definitely work your back extension all the way from corner to corner. But I've put a stitch marker here in the third space, so you can count from your top corner on both hexagons, and this is side 3 of my right hexagon. It would be side 5 of your left hexagon. You're just going to count from that top corner down 1, 2, 3 and put a stitch marker there along the back. And then in the front, this is where you're going to decide how low cut you want your dress to be. So as sort of average, and what you see in the photos is placing the stitch marker in the 6th space. And this is indicating to us that our front extension is just going to be worked right here, and that's going to create that pretty square neckline in the front. If you want more coverage or the dress to go up higher, just put your stitch marker up a little bit higher, and that's going to raise the entire front of the dress up closer to your chin. Of course, if you would prefer a V-neck dress or something that just flops open like this, then just work the full side from the corners like this, and then leave some of it unseamed. So I'll show you when we get to that part how that modification can be made. But if you like the general neckline that's pictured in the photos, then you can just follow along with the written pattern, and it'll tell you exactly which space to place your stitch marker in based on the size that you're making. Again, I have mine in the 3rd space down on the back and the 6th space down on the front. All right, now I'm going to show you how to work the back extension. So we're going to just rotate this right here, and our back is going to be worked alongside 3 only of our right hexagon. So I rotated this because we're just going to work in this little section right here. So these rows really go by a lot faster than your final hexagon rounds. Now I want to point out to you something that's going to become important depending on if you're right or left-handed. Right-handed crocheters are going to attach their yarn right up here for the right side of the dress. So I'm going to attach mine in the chain space that is marked. If you're left-handed though, in order to start this row, you need to attach it in this hexagon corner. So that's the corner between side 3 and side 4. So you're going to start over here and work in this direction toward the marker. If you're right-handed, you're going to start here and work this way. And then the opposite will be true on your second hexagon, the left hexagon. So it's just simply a matter of geometry, which side you're starting on and which is your dominant hand. But everyone's going to get a turn with everything, because whatever you do here, you're going to do the opposite to start your extension on the other side of the dress. One of the most important ways just to make sure you're on track is to ensure that the right side of your fabric is facing out. So I know that mine is because I have these labels here, but also I can tell that the last hexagon round I worked is a wrong side round, and we always want to be alternating right and wrong side rows or rounds, so I'm in good shape there. I just like to point these things out because sometimes if you kind of look for these mile markers, you can catch a mistake you're about to make before it happens, which is always the best time to notice. Take it from my experience. So I like to just give you a heads up so you can look for signals that you're on the right track. And because I'm right-handed, I'm attaching my yarn in this marked space here. So I like to do that by just starting with a slip knot on my hook and then inserting my hook where I want the yarn to be attached and pulling up a loop like a slip stitch and just pulling it right through that slip knot. And then as long as my slip knot is fairly loose, I can just tighten it down and then my yarn is attached. And now we want to start this row with a chain 3. That's going to count as our first double crochet. So we want to put 2 more double crochet in that same space where our yarn was attached. If you're left-handed and working from that corner, you're going to put 3 double crochet in that corner space. And then we'll proceed with a chain 1 and 3 double crochet in the next space. This is probably quite familiar because it's the same pattern we did in the hexagon. We're just only working on one side of our hexagon. So I've got 3 double crochet,
chain 1, I'm skipping that next cluster, and then I'm going to put 3 double crochet in the next space, and we're going to continue like this across this side. So if you're right-handed, you're working down to that corner of your hexagon, and if you're left-handed, you're working up to your marked stitch. And I've made it now down to my hexagon corner. So I've ended with 3 double crochet. I haven't quite finished that double crochet, and I'll show you why in just a second. But one thing I want to point out about these extension rows is that they're always going to start and end in the same way. So if you remember back to how we started this row, it was a 3 double crochet cluster, a granny stitch cluster at the beginning of the row, and then we're ending it in the same way with 3 double crochets. So that's just another one of those ways that you can check to make sure you're on the right track. And now I'm going to switch colors in order to maintain my stripe pattern. So that's why I haven't finished off this double crochet yet. I'm going to complete my final yarn over with my new color. So I'm just going to pull that through right here, and then I can fasten off my first color and proceed with my new color for row 2. So as I begin row 2, I am going to chain 4 this time. This is going to count as our first double crochet and our first chain 1 space. So now I'm going to flip this around and work back in the opposite direction. So this is a wrong side row, and I'm just going to skip over this first cluster because I've got my double crochet in my chain 1 space, and I just need to put my first cluster into the first space I come across here. So we've got 2 double crochets, and that makes 3, and now I can chain 1 and work 3 double crochets in the next space. And I bet you know what comes next. We're going to chain 1 and put a granny stitch cluster in each of our chain 1 spaces until we get to the end of this row. And now at the end of this row, I want to chain 1 and put a double crochet in the top of that turning chain from the first row. So it doesn't matter if you are left-handed and down over here at the corner, or if you're right-handed and you're up here by the marked stitch, our row is going to end the same with a double crochet. And if you look back here at how we started the row, we began with a chain, which counts as our first double crochet. So you can see the symmetry now in row 1 begins and ends the same way, row 2 begins and ends the same way. And now we're just going to continue in this pattern for the number of rows that are specified for your size. And I am going to switch back to my main color now, which means I'm just going to take out this final yarn over of that last double crochet and instead grab my new color and complete that stitch with a yarn over using my new color. And this is always a bit to hang on to at first, but it gets much easier after your first stitch in the new color. So to begin row 3, I'm going to chain 3 stitches and then turn and work back in the opposite direction. And this is essentially a repeat of row 1, where we're going to start with a cluster. So that's 3 double crochets in a row in that first space. And then I'm going to chain 1, put a 3 double crochet cluster in the next space, and then continue down the row just like this, ending in my last space with a 3 double crochet cluster. So we can continue now repeating rows 2 and 3 until you've reached the number of rows suggested for your size in the pattern. And my suggestion is to keep your yarn attached at that point. If you have enough balls of yarn to do so, keep your yarn attached as you work each of the front and back extensions, because it's quite easy then to adjust the circumference of the bust by adding or subtracting rows at that point. And keeping your yarn attached just means you don't have to create any new ends to weave in should you decide to work a couple more rows. So let's continue like this until we have our first extension finished, given the number of rows you need in the pattern, and we will meet back here and talk about how to use these same skills on the rest of the front and back extensions.
So this is what an extension looks like after you've completed the rows. I still have my yarn attached here. I just put a stitch marker in the live loop and then I wound off a small ball. So when I try this on, if I decide I want a little bit more of an extension here, I can easily add some more rows. But what I've done is several rows in the pattern, and this is my right hexagon. So I just wanted to point out to you that the skills you just used to do the back extension on your left hexagon are exactly the same skills you'll use to do your back extension on the right hexagon, and the same skills you'll use then in the front extensions as well. The only thing that differs from right to left side of the dress, and if you're right or left-handed, is where you're attaching your yarn. So all of that is very clearly explained in the written pattern, and it's also quite intuitive once you start looking at the right versus the wrong side of your fabric. So you're always going to want to have your right side facing for this first row, and you want to attach it so that you're able to just crochet in your normal direction. So that will vary depending on if you're on the right or left side of the dress, front or back extension. But I think once you see it in the written pattern, it makes quite a bit of sense, and you're going to end up with two symmetrical hexagons so that side by side you lay them out and they look like a mirror image of each other. Okay, this is so exciting. You've made it to one of my favorite parts in the whole process, and that is folding your hexagons up and trying on your work in progress. So I've already pinned mine together here. You can see I have my front extensions pinned right here, and my back extensions are pinned in the same way, and then I have my sleeves also pinned right up here along the shoulder. And when I'm pinning these, I am doing my best to make sure that I pin them fairly flush so that they're not able to stretch super far apart, because when we try this on, what we're mostly evaluating is how the bust is fitting, so how it's fitting around your chest. And if our pins aren't tight enough together, that could give us another ½ inch or an inch here when it's separating apart, and that would be sort of misrepresenting how the final dress is going to fit once we've seamed this together and it's not stretching apart anymore. So that's just one thing to note when you're pinning. I am using some stitch markers. You can use stitch markers, or if you have little clips, those work too. But you're going to want to pin it together and then try it on and just admire the awesomeness that is your hands for creating this little mini sweater. I love how it's looking as a little cropped sweater, and I'm so tempted not to extend it anymore because it's so cute like this. When you're trying on your work in progress, you want to be assessing how the bust is fitting you and if you like how loose or tight it's fitting. And you also want to be thinking about how the same circumference is going to fit around your hips, because we're not going to increase anymore after we seam these together. This is what you get. And so you want to be thinking about how this is going to wrap around all parts of your body, including your chest and your hips. So one thing that I like to do is just take a measurement across when it's laying flat like this. So I am at about 20 3/4 inches. So you can multiply that by 2. So that lands me just shy of 42 inches, about 41.5. And that's essentially going to be the circumference around the sweater. So then you can take a flexible tape measure, not one like this, but one that bends a bit easier, and measure your hips so that you can get a sense of how would 41 or 42 inches fit around my body. That would be really tight, or that would be really loose. If you find that it's going to be really tight and you don't want a tight look, now would be the time to add some extension rows, because that's what's going to give you a little bit more ease or looseness in how your dress fits overall. So when I tried mine on, I liked how it was fitting at the chest, but I also recognize that I have had 3 babies and my hips need a little bit more give in this dress overall. So I'm going to add a bit more distance here by adding some extra rows in my front and back extensions. And then I will meet you back here and we'll talk about how to join these front and back seams and the shoulder seams so that we have an official pullover. All right, I've experimented with adding additional rows to my front and back extensions, and to be fully transparent, I just want to walk you through what I did and then what I tore out so that you could use any of my learnings for your own project you're working on. So what I did was I started by adding 3 rows on each extension. So that extended it by about like 1.5 inches to 2 inches on each extension. So that added actually close to 4 inches in the front, 4 inches in the back. So when I pinned it together and tried that on, I liked the fit around my bust, but I was struggling with the fact that it made the neckline quite wide because all of this was extended out. This was falling in a way that I knew it was going to sort of fall off my shoulders in a way that felt uncomfortable and weird. So I ultimately ended up ripping out 2 of the rows I had created on each extension. So we're back to the point where now I just have 1 extra row per extension. So just giving you some details so that when you are deciding how you want your bust to fit and how many rows you want to work in your extensions, you know some things to factor in. Once you're happy with how the bust is fitting, we're going to turn our project inside out because we're going to do some seaming with the wrong side facing. So I still have everything pinned together from trying it on. And when you're pinning in order to do the seaming, one thing you want to pay attention to is just making sure that you're lining up your clusters because you want your stitches to be as lined up as possible in the seam. So that just means you want to make sure that the first cluster here is lined up and then say the 5th cluster is lined up and so on, so that you don't have to think too much about where you're putting your needle as you seam each stitch. So we're going to get started with our upper sleeve and shoulder seam right here. And now that you're happy with how everything is fitting, you can fasten off all of those balls of yarn you had attached. I like to leave a long yarn tail somewhere around 1 meter long, 36 or so inches. And I use that for my seaming so that I don't have to create another end to weave in. But for our shoulder seams, we are going to need to attach a fresh piece of yarn. So grab a strand that is about 36 inches long and thread it on your tapestry needle. And then we're going to begin seaming at this corner and work toward the neckline. When I'm using a brand new piece of yarn to seam with, I like to weave in the end at the very beginning so that I don't have to thread my tapestry needle and do it again later. So I'm just pulling this through until there's just a little yarn tail left. I'll snip this piece off, but I'm going to work it back and forth a few times to get this anchored, secured in, and then I won't have to deal with this yarn tail later. I'll just snip off this little section that's left over. So I'm going back and forth through the densest part of this granny cluster a few times. And now that my yarn is anchored in, I'm just going to weave it through to the very middle of this corner space right here, and that's going to position my yarn in the right spot to begin my seam this way. So I'm actually going to just turn this around so I can get a better position for seaming. And again, this is the top of my sleeve right here, and just because I'm right-handed, I find it easier to work like this, and we're going to be working from the elbow over to the neckline. I recognize this is a bit hard to see with this dark yarn, so I've placed a piece of cardboard in here in hopes that it illuminates things a bit. But if you followed any of our other hexagon garment tutorials, we're doing the exact same method of seaming here. It is sort of a variation on the mattress stitch where we're zigzagging back and forth and working stitch for stitch, picking up each stitch as we go. So we want to work under both loops of the stitch on one side of the hexagon and then work back in the opposite direction under both loops of the same stitch on the opposite side. So that just helps make sure that our seam is lined up and lays as flat as possible. So with each stitch, I'm working from the bottom up through both loops. So I'm just picking them up, pulling my yarn out toward me, and then working across on the opposite side, going from the bottom and pulling my yarn out toward me. It's a lot like lacing shoes or lacing a corset or anything else that you might go back and forth. And we want to pull our seam tight enough that there aren't any gaps when there's a little bit of pressure applied, but we don't want to pull it so tight that any of the stitches bunch up unevenly. We're really just going for the most invisible look here. We don't want to draw any attention to the seam. It's just there to do the hard work of holding our hexagons together. So we're just going to work back and forth like this. I'm making sure to line up each double crochet of the granny clusters. So I just worked the first double crochet here, and then I did the same thing on the opposite side. Now I'm going to the middle one, and I'll go back and pick up the middle one on the opposite side. We're just working like this until we get to the end of our hexagon, and then we will finish off with the seam and repeat the same process on the opposite side. So because I already have my tapestry needle attached, I like to just weave in my yarn tail right then and there as the seam is completed so that I don't have to thread my needle again later. So when you get to the top of the shoulder, go ahead and weave in your yarn tail and then repeat the same process on your second sleeve. Once those sleeves are complete, we're going to do the same process on our front and back extensions. So this is why I had you leave a long yarn tail when you were fastening off. You can just grab one of those yarn tails that is in your last color row that you used, and then do that same zigzag stitch back and forth, picking up each stitch as you go. You can either work from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top. It doesn't matter here. And when you get to the end of the seam, just weave in your yarn tail and then repeat the same process on your back extension. So just to note, the inside of my sweater is still the right side. So we didn't turn it right side out. We keep the wrong side facing out the entire time we're seaming. And when we complete both of those seams, then we will pop it back right side out and admire our progress. And if you're using multiple colors like I am, this is a great time to stop and weave in a few of those ends because your future self is definitely going to thank you. I'm not going to necessarily give you this encouragement again, but I do find it so helpful on projects like this to just spend a few minutes here and there weaving in ends, because that prevents it from becoming an overwhelming job at the end. All right, isn't this so fun? Even if you stop right here, you have officially made yourself a sweater and you are a garment crocheter. So congratulations. But we're not going to stop here. We're actually going to continue and lengthen the bottom of our currently cropped sweater in order to make it into a dress. Right now, I like to focus on weaving in the ends on the bottom of my sweater, and that creates a nice edge for us to work our bottom extension. So go make yourself a cup of tea, put on a podcast, get those ends woven in at least along the bottom, and then we're going to turn our sweaters right side out so that now we can attach the yarn for the bottom extension. Our bottom extension rounds are going to work all the way around the bottom of our hexagons here and lengthen the dress to however long you want it. So we need to attach our yarn at one of the underarms. It really doesn't matter which one you choose. So I'm just going to rotate this around right here, and I am planning to attach my yarn right here. You just need to pick a chain one space and attach your yarn into it, because at that point that'll just mean that your seam, which is very barely visible, but where you join the rounds, is in a spot that isn't really the center of attention or the literal center of anything. And if you'd like to continue in your stripe pattern, that would be something you want to factor in here. So I'm going to use my main navy blue color for a round, but just consider how you want the stripes to begin as they go down from about your waist onward. And once my yarn is attached here, I'm just going to rotate this slightly so that I can see my stitches better. And we're going to begin by working into the bottom of a hexagon side. So in both cases, on both sides of your dress, you were working into side 4. And that doesn't matter a ton because at this point your hexagons should be oriented correctly because you've already seamed them together. To begin this round, I am going to chain 3, and just as before, that counts as our first double crochet, and so I want to put 2 more double crochets in this space. And now we're going to continue in the granny stitch across the bottom of this hexagon. So I've chained 1, I'm going to put 3 more double crochets in the next space, and then again I'll chain 1, 3 double crochets in the next space. And we'll continue like that until we get to the edge of our extension rows, at which point I'll show you what to do there.
And this is now my hexagon corner, so I'm going to put 3 double crochets in that just as if it's a regular old space, and that will put us officially at our extension edges. So we're going to continue in this granny stitch pattern, and we're just going to skip over our double crochet clusters. So if you see 3 double crochets at the beginning of that row, that just signals to you you're going to pop right over it, chain 1, and then work your next granny cluster into the space that follows it. So this is just a turning chain right here. You insert my hook under that entire turning chain and put 3 double crochets in that space. And then again, chain 1, jump right over this cluster of 3, put 3 double crochets into the next space, and you're going to continue in this pattern across both of your extensions, whether right now you just ran into your front extensions or your back extensions. We're just continuing like this, working into all the raw row edges that have a single double crochet or turning chain at them. And the total stitch count that you get for this round might differ from the written pattern if you modified your extension length at all. So if you added or subtracted rows in your extension, you're not going to have the stitch count that is listed in the pattern at the end of this round, and that is totally fine. I want to show you here what happens when we come upon the seam of our extensions. So right here is where I sewed them together, and I just want to work a cluster of 3 stitches kind of in the middle of that seam. So I'm just going to insert my hook sort of wherever I can make it fit. And I'm going to put 3 double crochets there so that we have a cluster represented. And that's just going to help this row lay flat. And then we'll carry on in our pattern, chaining 1 and working into our next space here. And now we're just going to continue like this. When you're working into the raw row edges, you're going to do it just as I've shown you, working into those spaces. And then along the hexagon edge, you'll just work in typical granny stitch where you're putting your granny clusters in each space. So let's continue like this. Pause the video and we'll meet back here at the end of round 1. At the end of round 1, you should have a cluster in your last space and then chain 1, and then all you need to do is slip stitch to the top of that chain 3 from the beginning of the round to join it. This is exactly what we did in our hexagon rounds. So I'm actually going to change colors here. So I'm going to grab my new color and complete that final slip stitch using the new color. Again, this is exactly what we did in the hexagon rounds. So I'm just going to pull it through and cinch everything down. And now I can continue with this new color. And because I'm only going to use this new color for 1 round, I'm going to keep my original color attached and then just pick it up again in my subsequent round. So that's one way to avoid cutting the yarn off and weaving in more yarn tails, but it's up to you. I'm going to just pick it up again in the back side, the wrong side of my fabric, so that you don't see the way it's carried up around. So from here, we are going to work back in the opposite direction because each of these is a turned round. So I'm going to begin with a chain 3 and then turn. I now have the wrong side of my fabric facing, and I want to work 2 double crochets in that first chain space. Again, those 3 chains count as my first double crochet, so I only need 2 more to complete this cluster. And then I'm going to chain 1 and put a cluster into the next space. And that is how we are going to work all of our extension rounds now. We're just going to do these granny stitch clusters, 3 double crochet, chain 1, 3 double crochet all the way around, and then slip stitch to the top of the chain 3 at the end of the round. So you can continue now in this pattern, working rounds, turning at the end of each until you have the length dress that you prefer. And because of the nature of how this is constructed, it's really easy to just pop it on, evaluate the length, and decide when you've worked enough rounds. So let's get to work on that, and I'll meet you back here when you're happy with the length of your dress. And while we're here, I'm so interested to know, are you creating a short, sassy dress, or are you adding a lot of length to your bottom extension here? Leave a comment down below because I'm really curious to hear how other people want to customize their dresses. All right, I hope you've been enjoying some crochet cruise control, working these rounds of the bottom extension. One tip I want to offer if you think you might want to make your dress longer, but you're also a little concerned you might run out of yarn, is that you could always put your live loop on a stitch marker after you've worked the recommended number of rounds. Just pop a stitch marker on there, then come back, work the sleeves, because that'll use up the amount of yarn, whatever it takes for your size. You'll use that yarn, and then you can know that pretty much the rest of the yarn that you have can be used for the bottom extensions. So that allows you to make sure you have enough to finish the sleeves, and then you just need a little bit left over of your main color to do the neckline. A very minimal amount though. So you can use most of the rest of your yarn to extend the length of your dress to however long you want it. And then when you're happy with the length of the dress, I want to show you how to add a simple slip stitch trim along the bottom. So you want to keep your yarn attached and make sure you have the right side of the dress facing. Regardless of if you worked a right side or a wrong side round for this last round of the dress, you want to have the right side facing as you work your trim round. And this is going to be the same trim that we use on the sleeves. So to do this slip stitch, we're just going to begin with a chain one, and then we're going to slip stitch in each stitch. So that means each double crochet and each chain stitch. And a slip stitch just looks like this. We insert our hook, so I'm working into my first stitch here, pull up a loop, and then just pull it through the loop on my hook. Then I work into my next stitch, pull up a loop, and pull it through the loop on my hook. So it's basically one step short of a single crochet. I've got two loops there, I just pull it right through like this. And that just creates a more finished look on the sleeves and around the bottom of the dress. So we're just going to work a slip stitch in each of the stitches around the bottom now. And one tip I'll offer for this is to make sure not to work your stitches too tightly, because slip stitches have a tendency to pull a little tight. So if you're finding that your slip stitches are a bit tighter than your other stitches, you just want to deliberately pull your loop up a bit, especially the first loop. So if I pull that yarn over through, then I want to just pull this up a little. I wouldn't want it to be cinched down tight like this, because that's just going to create too tight of a slip stitch. So if I pull it up a bit like this, and then yarn over, and then pull it through, the job here is just to not change the tension of the bottom edge of the dress. So what that means is probably working these stitches a little bit looser. Another trick you could do is just use a larger hook for this, but definitely just a little bit of deliberate attention to your tension will also work. So we're going to work like this all the way up around the bottom, and then when you get back to the place where you started, you're just going to do a slip stitch into your first stitch to join it, and then you can fasten off. And then once you weave in that end, you should have an edge that looks like this. The slip stitches are barely noticeable. It just gives these granny stitches a little bit more structure and creates that polished look at the bottom. So honestly, it's something maybe no one will ever notice, but the lack of it could leave your dress looking a little less polished. So these are the type of tricks that level up your crochet projects and really make them feel a little bit more pro. So now we'll move on to the sleeves. All right, let's add some sleeve extensions. So if you're part of the No Fail Garments course, you have a whole module on making different sleeve modifications. What I'm going to show you right here is how to work a basic sleeve extension with no increases or decreases. So the result is that whatever your sleeve opening is now here at the edge of your hexagon, then that is going to be the same opening that's at your wrist. So we're just going to work around this in turned rounds. So what you have right here is side one. It's been folded in half and seamed at the shoulder. So I'm going to turn it this way
It's a bit hard to see in this yarn, but this is my shoulder seam right here. And I have the right side of my dress facing out. And that is because the last hexagon round I worked here was a wrong side round. So we want to then work in the opposite direction, meaning that now we want it to be a right side round. So that should be true for all sizes. And the only thing that's different if you're right or left-handed here is where you're going to attach your yarn. So what I have right here, these two little spots, these are just the hexagon corners, and they came together and were seamed right here. So if you are left-handed, you are going to attach your yarn in this hexagon corner toward the left of the seam. If you're right-handed, you're going to attach your yarn right here to the right of the seam. I have a slip knot here on my hook, and as a righty myself, I'm going to work right into this hexagon corner and join my yarn there. Just pull up a loop, pull it through the loop on my hook for a slip knot, and then fasten it down. And then I want to work 3 chains right here. If you're left-handed and attach your yarn in the opposite corner, you're going to do the same thing there. You're just doing all the same steps. You're just working this direction, so you're working counterclockwise. And if you're right-handed, you're just going to work this direction, which means you're going clockwise. So we've got 3 chains. That's going to count as our first double crochet. You now just want to add 2 more double crochets in that first corner. So that is my hexagon corner there, and I'm going to create my first cluster. That's cluster number 1. And now chain 1. And we'll put cluster number 2 in the next hexagon space. There's 3 double crochets, and now this is quite straightforward. We're just going to chain 1 and put a 3 double crochet cluster in each chain space. Just like we've done all along at this point, chain 1 and then cluster in the next space. So let's work like this around the sleeve, and we'll meet back here and I'll show you how to work round 2. When you've made it around the sleeve, then you should end with a chain 1 and a slip stitch to the top of that chain 3. This is exactly how we've worked our bottom extension. It's just a lot narrower now. So I am ready to switch to a new color in order to maintain my stripe pattern. So that means I'm just going to do my slip stitch with that new color because this is my final yarn over of this round. So I'm picking up my new color. I'm gonna keep this navy blue color attached, and then I'm just going to chain 3 and turn and work in the opposite direction. So just like we did on the bottom extension, we're going to work in turned rounds back and forth like this. It is the exact same skill as that bottom extension, they just go way faster. And you can follow the pattern to know how many rounds we suggest for your size, but this is really personal. So I definitely recommend just trying it on and deciding how many rounds you like. And then you can fasten off, and you want to repeat the same number of rounds on your second sleeve. And when you're happy with the length of the sleeve, we're gonna add 1 more round of a slip stitch border here, just like we did along the bottom of the dress. So you wanna have the right side of your dress facing out, regardless of if you ended with a right or a wrong side round here. You're gonna turn it or not turn it so that you can work along the right side for this final trim. And I just chained 1 at the beginning here, and we're going to work into each stitch, just like we did before, with a slip stitch. So that's just a yarn over and pull it through the loop on your hook. And I'm working into all of the double crochets as well as the chain spaces. And if you remember from the bottom edge, we're trying not to pull these super tight because the point here is not to cinch in the wrist. It's just to give this final round of stitches a little bit more structure at the end of the sleeve. So we're working into each stitch sort of loosely, and we're just going to work all the way around the sleeve like this. And then when you get back to the first stitch, you'll slip stitch into that first stitch, and then you can fasten off. And then you'll repeat all the same steps that we just did for this sleeve on your second sleeve, and then we will be nearly finished with our dresses. And then the final finishing touch we're going to add around the neckline is to work a round of single crochet just to kind of create an even foundation. And then we're going to work a slip stitch border just like we have on the bottom and sleeves. So we want to have the right side of your dress facing out, and we just want to attach our yarn somewhere that's sort of inconspicuous. So I'm going to do that along the back edge. Here's the back of the neckline right here, and I'm just going to attach my yarn right here in this first row edge. And so I've got a slip knot on my hook, and I'm just going to tighten that down to attach my yarn and then chain one, and we're going to work in single crochet here at a frequency of 1 single crochet in each cluster edge like this, and then 2 single crochets in the edges where we have either a double crochet or a turning chain. So I'll show you what that looks like. It's just 1 single crochet right here. And then in an edge like this where we kind of have a space we're working into, we're just going to put 2 single crochets. And honestly, I'm saying that in quite a specific way, but really what matters here is that we just lay down a nice even foundation. So if you work at a slightly different frequency and it's laying flat and looking nice, then that's totally fine. That's the goal here. It's not about a stitch count. So because this is a chain space here, I'm going to put 2 stitches, and then this is a cluster edge, so I'm putting 1 stitch. So we're just alternating 1 single crochet, then 2 single crochets, 1 single crochet, and 2 single crochet. And right now, because I'm working across the back, I am going to run into a seam right here. So I'm just going to put 1 single crochet here. If you feel like you need one to cross over the seam, you can definitely put a single crochet in the middle of that seam, and then another single crochet in the next row edge, 2 in the next one. We'll work like this across both back extensions. And now that I've finished this back extension, I'm just going to open this up. This is the shoulder seam where we joined our hexagon sides together. So now we're working along the neckline. This is going over your shoulder, and we're crossing from one hexagon side to the next right here. So we're just going to work into this granny stitch side here by putting a single crochet in each stitch. So that's just single crocheting in each double crochet and then single crocheting in each chain one space. And again, it's less about stitch count and more about just setting up a nice foundation for our trim. So you can kind of decide what needs to happen as you transition from the back to the shoulder. If you want to pop a stitch in there, that's great. If not, that's totally fine too. We're just working like this. And right here, I'm at the place where I've joined my hexagon. So this is my hexagon seam right here. So I have a chain corner space of a hexagon and a corner hexagon space right here. So again, I'm just going to put a single crochet in each of them. And I'm also going to put a single crochet in the middle of that seam. Again, this is really up to you. You can see how it's looking, but this is a pretty big space to cover. So we just want to single crochet consistently. So I've got one in that space, one in the center, one in that space, and then we're going to continue single crocheting into each stitch until we get to our front extension edge. Now, as I work across these row edges right here, we're going to continue in that same pattern we established in the back, which is 1 single crochet into the side of our cluster rows and then 2 single crochets into the sides where we have that chain space. We're just going to work like that across. Again, you can put a single crochet in your center seam right there where you joined your front extensions, and then you're going to continue across your second front extension and then work with the same frequency you did on this shoulder right over here to complete your last shoulder edge, and we'll meet back up right here where we started this round. At the end of this round here, I'm just going to work under the top of my first single crochet and then just pull up a loop, pull it through like a slip stitch. And now we're going to work a round in the same direction using slip stitches. But it's a good time right now to take a look at how this round is laying. Just make sure you're happy with how your stitches look, the level of tension that's going on around the neck. It wouldn't be a bad idea to just try your dress on. Make sure you like how all of these stitches are falling, and if not, this is a very easy section to just tear out and rework it with a little bit different tension. But if you are happy with how it's looking, we're now going to work our round of slip stitch. And if you remember from the sleeves and the bottom, we're just going to chain one and then slip stitch into that first stitch, pull up a loop and just pull it through the loop on the hook. And we're going to do that into each of our single crochets. And the single crochets make it really easy because we've already sort of forecast where all our stitches are going to go. So we're just working in each stitch. Just a reminder again that we don't want to pull these slip stitches too tight, especially because this will influence how tight or loose the neckline is. So if you are finding that your neckline is hanging a bit looser than you want, you can use these stitches to intentionally tighten it up a bit. But if you like how it's falling, then you want to make sure you keep that tension by just slip stitching fairly loosely around this neckline. So let's continue with slip stitches in each of our single crochets until we get to the end of this round. And then at the end of the round here, you can work under your first slip stitch, which might be a little hard to find. Honestly, you really just need to slip stitch to something in that vicinity in a way that can end your round in a smooth way. So it may or may not be technically under the first slip stitch, but really what you're trying to do is just taper off your stitch here in a way that makes the round look seamless. So I've got mine fastened off there, and now I just need to weave in the rest of my ends, which I know I shouldn't say just need to, because you may have quite a few left, but I promise it is going to be so worth it when you get to try on this dress with no little pieces of yarn hanging from it. Once you've got those ends woven in, give yourself a huge pat on the back and then lay your dress down on a blocking board, or even a towel works fine. We just want to add a little bit of moisture to help all of our stitches get organized, help the drape of the dress a little bit, and smooth out any areas that feel just a slight bit bumpy or uneven. So because the size of this project is pretty big, you may have to block your dress in different sections, which is totally fine. I'm just going to show you right here how to take a look at the neckline, and that's just one of the areas that, because we're joining a bunch of different types of stitches, I'm definitely going to hit it with some steam to smooth everything out. And one of my favorite methods of blocking is to steam block. I've got a steamer right here, but you can also use the steam from an iron, and we never want to actually touch the heat source to the yarn. So you're just going to keep it a little bit away, a few inches above, and shoot the steam at the yarn. Now, I'm saying this with the major caveat that the type of blocking that you choose really depends on the yarn and the fiber type. So do a little bit of research depending on the yarn you're using. This Color Theory yarn is 100% acrylic, so I know that steam blocking is going to work fine as long as I don't touch the heat source to the yarn. So when I'm blocking, I have it already turned on and it's going to shoot a bit of steam out of here. And I'm just going to direct it at the areas of my dress that I want to make sure are smoothed out a bit, like this neckline here. And then ideally, after you have steamed this area, you would leave the dress laying like this overnight. I realize that if you have to do this in sections, you may have to move it around, which is totally fine. Then I would just suggest laying it flat, sort of patting it, tucking it in for a good night's sleep, just in a flat position so that it can fully dry. And then you are ready to try this on and do a twirl, because you have officially crocheted your own dress. Please tag us on social media, because I cannot wait to see your finished tailored to you dress. If you enjoyed this project, I think you'll really love the campfire cardigan, which is also made from 2 hexagons.